Who is innocent? Who is the enemy? It's a question Iraqi forces continue to face as they battle Daesh. With every retaken town, soldiers comb through the fleeing crowds looking for Daesh fighters. But there are fears that their families, mostly women and children, are being swept up in the crackdown. Last month, the city of Tel Afar was recaptured by Iraqi forces. Over 1,400 women and children suspected of being relatives of Daesh members were handed over and taken to a camp in Hammam Alil. They were then moved on to another camp, 10 kilometers north of Mosul in Tel Kaif. This is the detention site where Daesh family members are being held. Rights groups say conditions inside are unhygienic, that women and children aren't free to move around, and say their detention goes against international law. NGOs say the women and children are mostly foreign nationals from at least 13 countries who traveled to Iraq with their husbands to live under Daesh rule. But many were found without identification. Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi insists most are not guilty of crimes, although his government is under growing pressure to start trials for the detained wives. As for the young children, rights groups fear that with some countries refusing to take them back, many will be stuck in detention and stateless, paying for the crimes of their fathers with their future. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Geneva by Francesco Mota. He's the chief of the Middle East branch at the UN Human Rights Office and a former representative of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Iraq. And from Washington, D.C., Ismail Sudan II. He's a retired brigadier general with the Iraqi army and a former Iraqi defense attaché to the United States. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Francesco Mota, let me begin with you. What should Iraq be doing with these more than 1,400 people?
Well, the situation is actually very complicated because we have to put it into the context in which the conflict in Iraq has been taking place. It's a highly urbanized conflict where people have been engaged in committing various violations of human rights from the side of the Daesh in particular, where they're not clearly identified as being fighters, etc. So in the context of this conflict, it has been expected that the Iraqi government does have an obligation to ensure that civilians they're encountering, or people who are saying they're civilians are in fact civilians, that they may not have committed any crimes and that they actually may pose no risk to security. So the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and the Human Rights Office of the Assistance Mission in Iraq anticipated this very issue. And we made very strong representations to the government that in the process of the campaigns, they would probably encounter large numbers of women and children, and they had to meet certain minimum standards in terms of their humanitarian support, but also in terms of ensuring their legal rights and their protections generally. What we are concerned about is that because of the nature of what's taken place in Iraq, there's a lot of people who have had family members who are victims, and they may in fact take it into their heads to take justice into their own hands. And we fear that a lot of people who are associated with ISIL fighters, particularly their family members, women and children, could well be targeted for serious harm by people in revenge for what's happened to them in return. So it's a very complicated issue of balancing the protection, but also maintaining their rights and ensuring, of course, that they are given adequate standards of humanitarian assistance. In this case, and going on from the report that I just heard, we had information that the 1,500 or so women and children, which are around 650 women and nearly 900 children, are actually identified as foreigners. And some of the problems that they're facing is that a lot of them, as was mentioned in the report, don't have documentation. And so identifying exactly where they come from, despite their claims of being foreign nationals, is sometimes hard to ascertain. So at the moment, we understand that the government is undertaking security vetting of these individuals, but that once they're cleared, they will be, in fact, notified to their consulates, and the consulates, therefore, will be able to take action, provided, of course, the individuals concerned haven't been found to have committed crimes or other violations under Iraqi law. Our bottom line, though, is, of course, at all times, civilians, people who claim to be civilians, should be protected and respected at all times, and they should assume to be civilians until proven otherwise, particularly the case of the children, because we know the children themselves can't be involved in any actions that were untowards or constituted violations of Iraqi law. So we are particularly concerned about the children and the standards in which these children are being cared for.
Yeah.
So the longer it goes on, the greater concerns we have.
Yeah, certainly, and unequivocally, the children are innocent. Let me ask Ismail Sudani, let me bring you in here, and let me ask you if it was a bad idea to have these people who are the families of Daesh in the same camps as people who are under the heel of Daesh, people who suffered under Daesh, people who starved, people who were oppressed by Daesh. Isn't that a recipe for reprisals and all manner of problems?
If they are, detained in the same camps, I don't think so. This is an appropriate approach to put them together, because people who are suffering from Daesh are furious, and they may take revenge against them. So I think the responsibility of the Iraq government to put them in a separate camp to protect them. If not, even they are innocent and they don't have any crimes against humanity, and they didn't perpetrate any kind of crimes against the civilians, which they have found, in fact, in an area that under the ISIS control, they are affiliated to ISIS. So we do not know for sure whether they are associated to the crimes that committed by ISIS to the minorities and ethnicities in the area, like Yazidis and some other minorities. So in this case, it's Iraqi government is responsible towards, and committed to the international community to provide, not to release them right now until they investigate and interrogate them. We don't know, never know what they are, what their charges are. And Iraqi government should work with the international coalition to interrogate them, because they are representing a valuable, sources of intelligence. Still, the campaign to eradicate ISIS is ongoing. And there are lots of, ISIS elements are outside Iraq, and they need to be followed by the international community. Iraq does not want to leave them and release them, and there would be no country would receive them.
Right.
Or they release them internally to the locals, so they would, humiliate them, they would kill them. Iraq should protect them, even there would be no legal procedures against them.
Okay.
Again, they are foreigners. They are not relevant to the area where they have been caught.
Okay.
And therefore they are responsible.
Allow me to come in here, and
yes.
you made your point very clearly. Let's have a little listen to a Peshmerga fighter. Now, for a lot of them, the Peshmerga had actually caught them and handed them over to the Iraqi army. This is what we heard from the Peshmerga. Have a little listen.
In fact, these displaced people who turn themselves in, they're not displaced people. They're all Daesh, and they all wore explosive belts, and these are the belts in front of you.
Let me ask you, Francesco, so you have the Peshmerga from among them saying, some of them had explosive belts. There were reports following some of the work of Janan Musa, where she interviewed some of these Daesh wives. Some of them seemed very complicit in the slave market, especially when it comes to, raping Yazidi girls and so on. So you have a certain amount of people who were complicit in crimes, and they were active members of Daesh. You have their children who are absolutely innocent, right? And then you have a lot of other people who might have been swept up in the situation. When it comes to actually vetting people in a security sense, do you, Francesco, trust that the Iraqis are able to sort of pass this out and figure out who's an active member of Daesh, who's not, who was just swept up, who would be responsible for crimes and who would not? How does this work, Francesco?
Well, in fact, I was last in the area of Mosul in May this year, and I did meet with a number of the security agencies who are responsible for doing this sort of vetting. The Daesh actually were quite meticulous about documenting who their members were, and in many cases they left behind offices with large volumes of information, including application forms and membership forms, photographs, details of addresses, names, birthplaces, etc., of people who were affiliated or associated with them. And basically the categories have been arranged according to a person's level of involvement with the Daesh as to whether they were a fighter, whether they were an administrator, whether they were a supporter, were they a member of the Al-Khansa in relation to some of the women, and then of course whether or not they are individually linked with having committed any sort of violations, crimes or atrocities. Now, as I said, this is a process, and the government does of course have an obligation to ensure that people who have committed crimes are brought to justice, but they also have an obligation to respect due process and fair trial standards, to ensure, for example, that those who are being detained and who will ultimately be charged there is in fact evidence to warrant such charges, and in the meantime people should be assumed to be innocent and should be given all the cares and protections that civilians deserve in that context. As I said, it's a very delicate and tricky situation given the environment in northern Iraq, where a lot of people have suffered from violations at the hands of the Daesh. People want to see vengeance or revenge or sometimes justice for those crimes that were perpetrated against them. So you've got to balance the obligation of the state to protect these people, but also to provide them from due process. And of course the physical environment up there has largely been destroyed. A lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed, and so it's extremely difficult. We've spoken to some of other agencies who do have access to this particular caseload, who assured us that their basic humanitarian needs were being met. But as I said, the longer it goes on, the more concerns we have that some of these women and children may end up in a limbo, particularly if they're not going to be charged formally. What's going to happen to them? Without documentation, will their countries accept them and take them home? And of major concern is the children, because as I said, children are innocent in all of this, and we have to extend this outwards to understand that there are hundreds of thousands of children in the north of Iraq who've been subjected to years, a number of years of Daesh indoctrination. And we also have to look at how those children's needs are going to be met in terms of basic services, education, healthcare, etc., to rehabilitate these children and to rebuild their communities. So this is a narrow question in relation to this particular caseload, but it's also a question that has to be raised in relation to the larger population of the north of Iraq. Right. And the government is confronting some very serious problems in relation to that, and as I hope that the international community will be there to assist find some of the solutions for those problems.
Ismail Sudani, what will the Iraqi government do if these countries don't want to take these people back? I mean, there's a kaleidoscope of countries that have been mentioned, and a lot of the time it's guesswork from the people who are interacting with them, because they're basing it on the languages that they're hearing in the camps, and sometimes people are saying they're from a certain country, but they're not actually from that country, and so on. So it might be an international diplomatic mess, especially if many of these countries don't want to take them back. What's the Iraqi government going to do?
Well, I think Iraq government should put the international community and the organizations, international organizations, in front of their responsibilities to take over this kind of challenges that pose on Iraq and the national security of Iraq. Daesh is not a normal criminal organization. It is designated as international terrorist groups, and there is a coalition, international coalition now campaigning ISIS to eradicate it. And there are lots of threats to all over the world, in Europe and in America and in Asia. Everywhere we can see there is a threat of Daesh and that particular acts of against humanity. That's why I think Iraq government is cooperating with the UN and has forwarded a letter on August asking the international organization to help the Iraqi government in investigating the ISIS, crimes and their, acts against humanity and what they have done in Iraq as well. And I think the United Nations has responded with Security Council Resolution 2379, which has been issued on September 19th, or I don't know exactly the date, but that means that Iraqi government should work with the international community, should work with the international organization to solve this complicated issue. Right. I don't think so that those countries, their home countries, would deny their identity. In this case, Iraq should, make the United Nations organization responsible of these. If they are not, if they are proved they are victims, they are misled by their ISIS husband elements. We don't know yet, because the investigation would prove whether they have perpetrated crimes against humanity. And I have, read, in the last days, a report saying that one lady, her husband was released, an enslaved girl. That means she was part of this kind of crimes against humanity.
Yes.
And they, with their intention, they were, traveling to Iraq and to participate with Daesh and be part of the jihad, presumably al-jihad, what ISIS claim to act in a austerious way.
Right. Francesco, Iraq has the death penalty on the books. Being a member of ISIS means that you're likely to face the death penalty in Iraq. If you're a Daesh member, if they convict you, do you trust the Iraqi justice system to be just and fair when it comes to this issue? Because we've seen Haider al-Abadi calling for more executions. He said that last year he wants more executions of Daesh members. So do you trust them?
Well, we as the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, of course, stand opposed to the death penalty, and we've been taking this issue up very strongly with the government of Iraq, considering that we have ourselves, and I myself have witnessed weaknesses in the administration of justice in Iraq, and we do have concerns about compliance with international due process and fair trial standards. There does seem to be a reliance on confessions for the Iraqi judicial processes, which I've personally witnessed and monitored a number of trials where I've seen this happen, and particularly counter-terrorism trials. And we've been working very strongly, very closely with the authorities in Iraq to try and get legislative reforms that would guarantee respect for due process and fair trial standards. The other side of this, of course, is that Iraq has not yet introduced legislation which criminalises international crimes within the domestic jurisdiction. And of course, the first responsibility, the primacy of responsibility in terms of protection in reference to respecting these due process and fair trial standards, but also in terms of accountability and justice, must rest with the government of Iraq. So we've pressed the government of Iraq to consider legal reforms that would ensure respect for international standards and that would also criminalise international crimes, such as crimes against humanity, war crimes and acts of genocide within the domestic jurisdictions. At the moment, most people who are being charged under the anti-terrorism law of 2005. That law does not require really due process or fair trial standards in terms of its application, and it also is worded in a rather vague or broad manner. And we do have concerns that in this context, people may have death sentences passed against them where the evidence against them may not be strong. It may rest solely on a confession which is claimed to have been induced through forced or induced through torture or malpractice.
Right.
And for crimes that aren't the most serious crimes in terms of loss of life. So, of course, we've pressed the government of Iraq that what we would like to see is a moratorium on the death penalty. And I know this is really difficult in the circumstances of what Iraq has been through. But what we're asking for is real justice.
Okay,
we don't think that families who've been the victims of the Daesh will have justice if innocent people are punished for those crimes.
Okay, because we're running out of time, I want to get a final response from Ismail to that. And the point was emphatically made. Ismail, isn't that reasonable? Moratorium on the death penalty for now, because this is a big mess, and the UN is saying the Iraqi justice system, when trying to deal with this, especially with such a powerful tool as the death penalty, is weak and might not be able to mete out proper justice. Is a moratorium maybe the right thing to do, Ismail?
Well, I think that's, although we convinced that Iraqi justice maybe is weak, not very strong enough to impose law and order as Iraq designated as a fragile state, yes, but there would be unequivocal, undeniable evidences for any terrorist if he has affiliated to ISIS and committed crimes against the civilians in Iraq. and therefore there would be no any, I think, objections to be tried in the Iraqi judiciary system. And that there would be no objection from the international community. Maybe they object that the death penalty will be imposed on the accused persons of terrorism. Maybe that's according to the humanitarian or the human rights standards. But we cannot question the Iraqi judiciary system for sentencing those individuals who has participated, who has being part of the formidable, awful organizations that pose a threat to the national security, to the regional and international security, and to do. That is, I think, my answer to this question. Maybe the objection about the death sentence.
Okay, and the question is, will they get a fair trial? I mean, that's at the heart of it all. But I'm out of time. I have to move on. I thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Ismail Sudani and Francesco Mota, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.